Yeah, welcome back to the conversation. It's now time to switch gears to relations between South Africa and Russia. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, visited South Africa as part of the renewal of cooperation between the two countries, which has been present for 30 years of diplomatic relations, but goes further back to the 20th century when the Soviet Union supported the African National Congress in its fight against apartheid. The South African government has taken a neutral stance in the Ukrainian conflict, but this stance has been criticized by the Ukrainian diaspora in South Africa.
The Russian-South African relationship is expected to strengthen in 2023, with multiple delegations visiting each other and attending events like the Russia-Africa Summit and the BRICS Summit. Meanwhile, the U.S. is trying to insert itself into the relationship and has expressed concerns about the docking of a Russian ship under U.S. sanctions at a South African military base. South Africa is trying to maintain good relations with both Russia and the United States, which is a difficult task as the two nations are in a competition with each other. And now joining us for this conversation, we have Lwazi Somya, Senior Research Development and Programs Coordinator, joining us, Coordinator, Southern African Liaison Office. We also have Itumeleng Makgetla, Independent Political Analyst, who is joining us from Trumsburg. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us on this conversation.
Thank you so much.
All right, so I'll begin with you, Lwazi. I mean, we need some in-depth information about this Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergey Lavrov's visit to South Africa. It has caused quite an uproar on social media. What were the key objectives and outcomes of his visit to the country?
So before we start off with the visit itself, we must contextualize what happened over the last week. First and foremost, South African government received Minister Sergei Lavrov, as we must know that South Africa is currently chairing the BRICS cooperation grouping. And part and parcel of the BRICS grouping itself is ensuring that there's a higher trade, higher people-to-people interrelation between the BRICS member states, along with finding solidarity and enhancing diplomatic relations between member states of the BRICS grouping. Other issues discussed is how does South Africa now move forward in terms of dealing with its energy crisis, as we know that Russia is one of the largest energy suppliers in the entire international community, and therefore South Africa itself needs as many hands on deck to resolve its electricity crisis. Another aspect of this, the visit by Sergei Lavrov, was dealing with the nature of the insurgency in the Cabo Delgado region in Mozambique, and part and parcel is supplying South Africa as part of the Southern African mission in Mozambique Summit with the necessary weapons and training and skills. As we have seen over the last year, in 2022, there have been a number of military engagements between South Africa and a number of states. First, it was with the USA Navy. Second, it was with the French military. And then thirdly, it was with the Chinese military. And this coming year, it was with the Russian military and also the Chinese military. Obviously, those on the side of Ukraine will clearly point out the human rights atrocities done by Russia in the current war in Ukraine. However, South Africa has postured itself as a non-aligned member of the international community, meaning that they will not take sides in conflicts that are between two hegemonic entities. In this instance, South Africa perceives as a war in Ukraine as a proxy war with NATO, between NATO and Russia, and therefore we will take a non-aligned stance. That does not mean that South Africa itself will not cooperate with all members of the international community in order to find a dialogue-based peace towards the conflict in Ukraine.
Thank you, Lwazi. I'd like to bring in Itumeleng from Trumsburg. Now, Itumeleng, could you give us an overview of the historic diplomatic relationship between Russia and South Africa? I do understand that Russia was very supportive of the ANC struggle against apartheid.
Indeed. The diplomatic relations between South Africa and Russia really goes back a long way. And as you rightfully put, that the alliance between the ANC and the Kremlin is from the days of apartheid, where many of the ANC members or current leadership in the ANC were in Russia, either for military training, a lot of them in varsity, in schools, and so forth. But really, last year was only when South Africa and Russia celebrated 30 years of bilateral diplomatic relations. So this relationship is not a new one, and I would say that it is something that has been developing, and this time around, we see the Foreign Minister Lavrov here to cement those relations, those bilateral relations.
Well, now, Lwazi, I'm going to bring in a comment here because you talked about the non-aligned stance of South Africa. And now we're seeing last week International Relations Minister Naledi Pandor said it would be simplistic for South Africa to call for Russia's withdrawal, given the massive transfer of arms from Western countries to Ukraine. Now, are the minister's comments still in tandem with ANC's official position of neutrality, which you also position here on this program?
Yes, the minister's points were in line with the African National Congress, as it all depends on where you primarily locate your analysis. The ANC itself, stemming from the 55th National Conference, which was held in December last year, made the resolution that this is the war in Ukraine itself is part of the international conflicts between hegemonic states, and therefore the non-aligned posture itself of the African National Congress will not only produce a situation where it can play a diplomatic role in ensuring that there's dialogue between the two sides, but also play safe houses for the two sides to negotiate. As you have seen, South Africa's positioning played fruitful historically, including the war in Ethiopia and Eritrea, where South Africa played safe houses between the two conflicting states, and also played a very critical role in the formation of the government of national unity in Zimbabwe. So in this strategy by South Africa is premised on a notion that South Africa will play the interlocutor role of mediating between conflicting states and assuring diplomatic resolutions towards global conflict. And this falls in line with South African foreign policy in making. However, there have been criticisms upon this policy the ANC also says that it will fight for the protection of human rights and the right to existence of peoples of the world. And part and parcel of those criticizing the ANC and the South African government concerning its stance on Ukraine is that this is, of course, inconsistent with its human rights background. However, the notion of a negotiated settlement is part and parcel of a negotiated, the human rights aspect of the ANC, as they see the only resolution to conflict is not for the escalation of the conflict itself, but to bring the parties on board and sit around the table and discuss and find a more peaceful and longer term resolution to conflict. And this is part of the strategy that South Africa has employed on the international community, and it's proven to be fruitful in some instances, but it does meet with a lot of pushback from those who want South Africa to take a side on the conflict. And it has happened on a number of occasions, similar to what happened in the UN General Assembly, when there were a number of resolutions to be passed on Russia where South Africa abstained. These resolutions were not in consultation with South Africa, nor of the African states that were to vote on these resolutions, and were pushed onto African states. And this created a further antagonism between Africa and the West, as the West tried to dictate the terms of engagement in which African states are to engage diplomatically concerning addressing the war in Ukraine. We are not, we as Africans are not disillusioned about the conflict, as we see it as part of the longer stem of wars within the global international sphere as a result of the lack of reform within international multilateral institutions, including the UN Security Council. And I'm glad that President Biden has announced that he's willing to support Africa's proposition of reform of the UN Security Council, along with some European leaders. However, there's still pushback from other P5 member states in ensuring Africa and Africa in particular gets their voices heard at multilateral institutions.
Now, Itumeleng, on the 24th of February, Ukrainians will mark the first anniversary of the invasion of their land. And at the same time, South Africa will be hosting Russia and China in a war games naval exercise of the country's eastern coast, tagged Operation Mossy. It's been a topic of discussion in relation to South Africa and Russia's relationship. Is South Africa being defiantly tone deaf? And can you explain the purpose and significance of this operation in furthering the relationship between both countries?
I think, as my colleague pointed out, that this particular military exercise, this joint military exercise between the three partners under the umbrella of Brexit, it's not necessarily the government, the ANC, taking a standpoint and saying they are supporting Russia necessarily. I think what's equivocal here is that South Africa is saying we do not want to take sides, we would like to be neutral. However, because we have obligations with our partners, which is Russia and China, there is nothing untoward about having military exercises. Those joint military exercises are biannually, and they're not only exclusively happening between South Africa and these new partners under the BRICS umbrella. They also happen with the countries that are also members of NATO, i.e., for instance, France, as well as the United States. So I do not think that this is a way to see the exercise should be interpreted as though South Africa is explicitly declaring their stance about the issue. And I think that it is clear enough from the minister's mouth that we would like to have a negotiated settlement of this particular war. The point is to de-escalate, but not to escalate. Therefore, I do not think that this military exercise is anything untoward.
Okay, now, thank you so much, Itumeleng. Now, Lwazi, you both have tried to explain neutrality of South Africa in all of this, but the fact still remains that there's an attack on Ukrainian soil. And I wonder, I mean, what has been the reaction of Ukrainian diaspora in South Africa, and even the fact that there's presence of Russian soldiers in South Africa when the Russian soldiers are attacking Ukraine. What's the Ukrainian diaspora community feeling about all of this, and what are their concerns or issues?
As you have seen, there have been a number of protests that have been happening in relation to these various military exercises. Another protest has also happened concerning a Russian power station, coastal power station ship that was in the ports of Durban a few months ago. So there's been a lot of pushback towards South Africa's position, in particular in the continued relation. However, that same indignation does not fall when South Africa carries out joint military exercises with the U.S. government, with the U.S. military, or the French military, as we have seen human rights atrocities being carried out in their wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and also other parts of the Middle East, including the continued support of the occupation of Palestinian land. So the moral dichotomy that they're creating is based on a false premise. And part and parcel of this false premise is drawing false comparisons between the situation in Ukraine and the occupation by settler colonialists during apartheid. But also the issue at hand here is the consistency of South Africa in its non-aligned position. It is a difficult position to hold, as it basically primarily requires that a country place two adversarial countries against each other to meet its international, continental, and international interests. And part and parcel of that is not taking sides when people are pushing you to take sides on the matter. We realize that there hasn't been such an international mobilization also, and this is where the argument comes from the Global South, is that there hasn't been an international mobilization like this when conflicts have spewed out in the Global South. Similar issue happens with the occupation of Palestinians, which we are approaching in close to 80 years now of occupation of Palestinian land by Israeli occupying forces. Also the issue of Western Sahara and their plight against the Moroccan occupation of the Western Saharan land. And we also speak about the illegal international embargoes imposed upon Cuba, even though they're a peaceful nation currently. And all these stem from the rising global political tensions that are at play, that not only stem from the Cold War period, including the violation or not only of the Warsaw Pact, but also the continuation of the NATO treaty, which was a pushback against the Soviet Union. Ever since the dismantling of the Soviet Union, the NATO pact has been seen as an aggression towards Russia. And therefore, these situations always create much tensions upon countries when we deal with notions of sovereignty and the protection of human rights. But ultimately, what needs to happen, and South Africa gave a good direction in terms of the UN General Assembly, its UN General Assembly speeches, by stating that this conflict itself can only be resolved through dialogue and peaceful negotiations amongst the two warring parties. And from the iterations of President Zelensky, they are not willing to go towards a peaceful settlement of this conflict, and neither does Russia tend to back off of it on its advances. So we are stuck at a stalemate in terms of how we engage going forward as the international community.
And in South African countries, they're caught in the middle of this, and there's a lot of pressure on them to choose sides, like we've seen this interesting balancing act by South Africa. Now, America is talking tough. Thandi Modise, South Africa's defense minister, she said the Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act that is proposed to impose sanctions on any African businesses or people doing business with Russia is an attempt by the US to bully African countries into compliance and should be rejected by African countries. She went further to say, and I quote, "We cannot be bullied because we're a growing economy. We have national interests. We have regional interests. We must make sure we stand our ground where it counts." The American Treasury Secretary was in South Africa recently, and she had some tough words for the South African government, saying, look, if you do not respect American sanctions, there will be consequences for this. So as an independent country, what do you make of all of this geopolitical schisms and South Africa's stand? And of course, Thandi Modise's statement. Itumeleng.
I think it is important to note that from the South African point of view, this war has affected every citizen of this country. The high inflation that we've seen since the beginning of this war on food items, on fuel, the repo rates going up, the CPI going up, as well as the economy that is floundering, particularly after COVID. Thandi Modise's utterances are really legitimate because never in the history of South Africa has cooking oil, for instance, become more expensive than petrol. That is me just trying to really defrag the impact of this war, that the impact it has had on the normal people. So I think the scramble for Africa, now that America is also here trying to woo South Africa to get inside of this NATO grouping, it is actually a bullying tactic, because South Africa does not really have those interests, does not have the interest in escalating the war, but America itself is giving weapons to Russia. They're not talking about de-escalation. Germany is giving Russia terms,
Ukraine.
Indeed. Nobody is repudiating that. So I think Thandi Modise is fair when she says, but you know, with all these going on, we are also getting hurt in the process. So that's why South Africa, I think, can be seen to say, okay, America, in as much as we understand your agenda and as a part of NATO, we are not. South Africa is not a part of NATO. Okay. South Africa is an ally, even though it is non-aligned. But the fact that it shares membership with Russia on the BRICS table, it is expected to carry on with business, because at the end of the day, our economy is also floundering.
Okay, now, Lwazi, I understand South Africa. I mean, Africa's stance generally. I mean, South Africa here is trying to say that, okay, we have our own stand. We still want mutual relationship. But at the same time, I'm sure that South Africa would not want to destroy the relationship it has with the United States. I mean, we have Russia, we have China. These are all part of the G5 community states. And there's still a vote of no confidence going on for Russia. How does South Africa plan to manage or balance the relationship between Russia and the United States of America?
Well, it's awkward for both Russia and America because in 2025, South Africa is the chairperson of the G20. And this year, South Africa is the chairperson of the BRICS grouping. And therefore, South Africa has a very important role to play within the international community, having to engage with both actors on both sides of the conflict. And therefore, the non-aligned stance itself proves very critical for South Africa in executing its national and continental interest in all these multilateral institutions. As soon as South Africa departs from its obligations towards its friends and peers, not excluding the USA as its friend and peers, it negates South Africa's broader role within the broader international community. And once we are seen as an unreliable policy actor within the international community, as in terms of inconsistency in the application of our foreign policy, while relevance in our soft power will decline. And therefore, South Africa needs to continue playing this line. However, recognizing that the United States itself and also some Western actors and also Russia, let's not negate Russia, has also tried to have South Africa take a side in this conflict. But South Africa has pushed back up against all sides to remain in a very non-aligned position. And the spirit of non-alignment itself is very critical for the global South in order for us to foster people-to-people solidarity and people-to-people unity beyond the immediate fascination of the elected political elite at that periodic time and moment. Beyond that scope, or what if a consistent foreign policy does, it ensures that there's a recognizable behavioral patterns when systems of international governance fail. And South Africa is towing that line in terms of its foreign policy creations. The threats by Janet Yellen will not materialize because South Africa is a very, very reliable partner on the African continent in terms of peace and security, the HIV/AIDS programs, research, people-to-people relations, tourism, along with regional and continental stability. And therefore, the USA itself cannot risk losing an African ally in these trying geopolitical times. And especially if they're seeking to re-engage with the African continent following the Trump administration's nationalist approach towards the African continent.
Well, thank you so much. It seems South Africa really has a non-aligned stand on this. Well, we'll see how that pans out, relationship with other foreign partners. Thank you so much, Lwazi Somya, Senior Research Development and Programs Coordinator, Southern Africa Liaison Office. And also a very big thank you to Itumeleng Makgetla, independent political analyst who's joined us from Tromsburg. Thank you so much for joining us on this conversation.
Thank you very much.